The morning light had not yet touched the valley when Ezra opened his eyes. He lay still for a moment on the thin mat of woven reeds that served as his bed, listening to the sounds that defined his world. The low murmur of his father's voice came through the walls of their modest home, a structure of sun-dried clay bricks with a flat roof made of timber beams layered with packed earth and straw. His father, Abram, was already speaking the ancient words of morning devotion, his voice rising and falling in the rhythmic cadence that Ezra had heard every single day of his 14 years of life. It was not merely a habit. It was the very foundation upon which the family's existence was built. Ezra sat up slowly, careful not to wake his younger brother Micah, who was curled beside him, still deep in sleep. Micah was only 8, small for his age, with a round face that still carried the softness of childhood. Ezra envied him sometimes, envied the simplicity of his brother's world, where the hardest question of the day was whether the goats would cooperate during the evening milking. For Ezra, the questions had become far more complicated. He was approaching the age when a boy was expected to become a man, to take on the full weight of his family's traditions, to understand not just what they believed, but why they believed it. And lately, the weight of that expectation had begun to press against something inside him that he could not name. He rose quietly and made his way through the narrow doorway into the central room of the house. It was a modest space, no larger than what a modern person might consider a small bedroom. But in this time, it was the heart of the household. A low stone table sat near one wall, upon which rested a clay oil lamp, still flickering weakly from the night before. Beside it, a ceramic jug of water and a small basket of flatbread, baked the previous evening by Ezra's mother, Naomi. The floor was packed earth, swept clean each day with a bundle of dried palm fronds. In one corner sat the family's most valuable possessions: a set of grinding stones for grain, 2 clay cooking pots, and a bronze knife that had belonged to Abram's father. These were not just tools, they were inheritance, they were identity. Abram stood near the doorway that opened to the small courtyard, his face turned toward the east, where the first thin line of gold was beginning to separate the sky from the hills. He was a man of 43, though he looked older. His hands were rough and darkened by years of working the rocky soil. His beard, once fully dark, was now threaded with silver. But his eyes held a depth that Ezra had always found both comforting and intimidating. They were the eyes of a man who had seen drought and plenty, who had buried his own parents in the stony ground, who had bargained for his wife at the village well, and built this home brick by brick with his own hands. Abram was not a wealthy man. He was not a priest or a scribe. He was a farmer and a shepherd, one of the countless ordinary men who formed the backbone of their community. And yet, in his own household, he was the spiritual authority, the teacher, the judge, and the protector. Ezra watched as his father completed his prayers. He watched the way Abram pressed his palms together, the way he closed his eyes and tilted his head slightly upward, as if he were truly speaking to someone just beyond the edge of the morning sky. Ezra had always wondered about that. Did his father really believe there was someone listening? Or was it simply what one did? What everyone did, because it was what had always been done? These were dangerous questions, and Ezra knew better than to speak them aloud. In their world, faith was not a matter of personal choice. It was the air they breathed, the structure that held everything together. To question it was to question the ground beneath your feet. Abram turned and saw his son standing in the doorway. A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "You are awake early," he said, his voice low and steady. "The fields will wait for us, but the morning words will not." Ezra nodded and moved to stand beside his father. Together they repeated the ancient blessings, words of gratitude for the new day, for the breath in their lungs, for the land that sustained them. Ezra spoke the words from memory, his lips moving in the familiar patterns, but his mind was elsewhere. It was drifting, as it often did lately, toward the edges of the village, toward the wider world that he knew existed beyond the hills but had never seen. Naomi appeared from the back of the house, moving with the quiet efficiency that defined her days. She was a woman of 36, with dark hair pulled back beneath a cloth covering, and hands that were never still. She carried a clay bowl filled with fresh goat milk, still warm, and set it on the stone table alongside the bread. Breakfast in their household was simple: bread, milk, sometimes a handful of dried figs or olives. There was no ceremony to it, no leisurely conversation. The day's work was waiting, and in a world without machines, without running water, without any of the conveniences that modern people take for granted, every task required the full effort of every member of the family. Naomi's role in the household was vast and unrelenting. She was the first to rise and the last to sleep. She ground the grain each morning, kneading the dough and baking it in the small clay oven in the courtyard. She drew water from the village well, a walk of nearly half a mile each way, carrying the heavy jug on her shoulder. She spun wool and wove cloth for the family's garments. She tended the small garden behind the house where she grew herbs and vegetables. She nursed the children when they were sick, prepared the bodies of the departed for their rest, and managed the complex social obligations that connected their family to the wider community. And through it all, she prayed. Not with the formal, public devotion of the men, but in whispered words over the bread dough, in silent pleas as she watched her children sleep, in the quiet songs she hummed while working at the loom. Her faith was not performed. It was lived. Little Micah stumbled out of the sleeping room, rubbing his eyes and yawning. Naomi scooped him up without breaking stride, pressing a piece of bread into his hands. "Eat quickly," she told him, her voice gentle but firm. "Your father needs help with the flock this morning." Micah groaned softly, but did as he was told. In this household, obedience was not negotiable. It was not maintained through harshness. Abram was not a cruel man, but through a deep, unspoken understanding that the survival of the family depended on everyone fulfilling their role. A child who refused to work was not merely being difficult. They were endangering the entire unit. As the family ate their simple breakfast in the growing light of the courtyard, Ezra looked around at the faces of his parents, his brother, and felt a strange tightness in his chest. He loved them. He loved this life, in the way that one loves the only world they have ever known. But somewhere, deep in the quiet spaces of his young mind, a question was forming. A question that would, in time, reshape everything he understood about faith, family, and what it truly means to believe. The morning sun broke fully over the hills, flooding the valley with golden light. Abram stood, brushed the crumbs from his hands, and looked at his sons. "Come," he said. "The land is waiting." And so the day began, as it had begun every day before it, and as it would begin every day after, with prayer, with bread, with work, and with the quiet, relentless rhythm of a life built entirely on faith. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal. Every week we bring you stories that take you deep into forgotten worlds and lost lives, revealing truths about human nature that no textbook ever taught you. If you do not want to miss a single one, subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because these stories are the kind that stay with you long after they end. The fields that Abram's family tended were not vast. They stretched across a modest hillside, perhaps 2 acres of rocky, terraced land that had been cultivated by 3 generations before him. The soil was thin and stubborn, filled with stones that seemed to multiply no matter how many were cleared. Each spring, Abram and his sons would spend days pulling rocks from the earth and stacking them along the borders of the terraces, building the low walls that held the precious topsoil in place during the seasonal downpours. It was brutal, back-breaking work, and it was only the beginning. Ezra walked behind his father on the narrow path that wound through the olive trees toward the upper field. The morning air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wild thyme and the distant bleating of sheep from neighboring pastures. Abram carried a wooden plow over one shoulder, a simple device, little more than a sharpened stick fitted with a bronze tip, attached to a wooden frame that could be pulled by their single ox. Ezra carried the seed bag, a rough cloth sack filled with barley grain that his mother had carefully measured the night before. Every grain was precious. A miscalculation in planting could mean the difference between a full storehouse and a hungry winter. As they worked, Abram spoke. He always spoke while they worked. Not idle conversation, Abram had little use for small talk, but instruction. He told Ezra about the proper depth for planting, about reading the clouds for signs of coming weather, about which insects were friends to the crops and which were enemies. But woven through every practical lesson was something deeper, the spiritual framework that gave meaning to every task. When Abram pushed the plow into the earth, he murmured a blessing. When he scattered the seed, he spoke words of hope and trust. When he looked at the sky and judged the likelihood of rain, he did not simply rely on observation. He also prayed. "The land does not belong to us," Abram told Ezra as they paused to let the ox rest. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and looked out over the valley below. "We are caretakers. The land was here before our grandfathers, and it will be here long after our grandchildren have returned to the dust. Our task is to tend it faithfully and to teach those who come after us to do the same." Ezra nodded, but inside, the question pressed again. What if the land was simply land? What if the rain fell because of wind and clouds, not because of prayers and rituals? He pushed the thought away, ashamed of it. and bent back to his work. The midday meal was eaten in the shade of a large terebinth tree at the edge of the field. Naomi had sent food with them: more bread, a small jar of olive oil, a handful of dried grapes, and a piece of hard cheese made from their goat's milk. Micah lay on his back in the grass, squinting up at the sky, making shapes out of the clouds. Abram sat with his back against the tree trunk, eyes closed, breathing deeply. For a few minutes, the world was still. The only sounds were the buzz of insects, the rustle of leaves, and the distant call of a bird. It was in these quiet moments that Ezra felt closest to understanding what his father meant when he spoke of the divine presence in all things. Not a figure in the sky, but something in the silence itself, something that filled the spaces between heartbeats. But the peace was broken by the sound of footsteps on the path. Ezra looked up to see a familiar figure approaching: Joram, the village elder's son. Joram was 17, tall and confident, with the easy swagger of someone who had never known real hardship. His family owned the largest flock in the village and employed several laborers to work their land. Joram himself rarely worked. He spent his days at the village gate, where the men gathered to discuss business, settle disputes, and exchange news from travelers passing through. He was known for his sharp tongue and his even sharper ambition. "Abram!" Joram called out as he approached. His tone carried a casual familiarity that bordered on disrespect. "My father sends word. The village council is meeting this evening. There is a matter to discuss regarding the water rights for the eastern cistern." Abram opened his eyes and regarded the young man calmly. "I will be there," he said. Joram nodded, but his gaze had already shifted to Ezra. A slow smile spread across his face. "Still working the fields, I see," he said, his voice carrying a note of amusement. "My father says a man who spends all his time looking at the ground will never see the stars." Ezra felt the heat rise in his cheeks but said nothing. Abram placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gentle pressure that said, "Be still. Be patient." Joram lingered a moment longer, as if hoping for a reaction, then turned and walked back down the path. When he was gone, Micah sat up. "I do not like him," the boy said simply. Abram looked at his younger son and said, "It is not our task to like everyone. It is our task to treat everyone with fairness, even those who do not deserve it." He paused, then added quietly, "Especially those who do not deserve it." The afternoon wore on, hot and heavy. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Abram, Ezra, and Micah had finished planting the upper field and had moved the ox to the lower terrace. Their bodies ached, their hands were blistered and caked with dirt. But there was a satisfaction in the work, a bone-deep sense of accomplishment that came from shaping the earth with your own hands. As they walked home in the fading light, Abram began to sing. It was an old song, one that had been passed down through more generations than anyone could count. The words spoke of faithfulness and trust, of seasons and harvests, of the deep, enduring connection between the people and the land that sustained them. Ezra listened, and despite all his questions, despite all his doubts, he felt something stir inside him. Not certainty, not belief exactly, but something close to it. Something warm and persistent, like the last light of the day clinging to the tops of the hills before the night took hold. When they reached home, Naomi was waiting in the courtyard. The evening fire was already burning, and the smell of stew, a thick mixture of lentils, onions, and herbs, filled the air. The family gathered around the fire as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the deepening sky. Abram spoke the evening blessings. Naomi ladled the stew into clay bowls. Micah ate hungrily, his fatigue forgotten in the pleasure of warm food. And Ezra sat quietly, watching the firelight dance across his father's face, wondering what the man truly saw when he looked up at those stars, wondering whether he himself would ever see the same thing. The evening routine was as fixed as the morning one. After the meal, Naomi cleared the bowls and banked the fire. Abram gathered the family for the evening recitation, passages of sacred law and wisdom that were to be repeated aloud, together, as a family. This was not optional. This was the most important ritual of the day. In their world, there were no books, no scrolls that ordinary families could afford. The sacred words were preserved in memory, passed from parent to child through daily repetition. If a single generation failed to learn them, they would be lost forever. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, and it was shared by every member of the family. Ezra recited the words alongside his parents, his voice blending with theirs in the flickering darkness. He knew every syllable. He had known them since before he could fully understand their meaning. And now, standing on the threshold of manhood, he was beginning to realize that knowing the words and understanding them were two very different things. Understanding required something more than memory. It required experience. It required the kind of testing that life had not yet given him, but soon would. The village well was the center of everything. It was where news was shared, where marriages were arranged, where disputes were aired and alliances were formed. Every morning and every evening, the women of the village gathered there to draw water, and in those gatherings, the true life of the community unfolded. Naomi went to the well twice a day, carrying the large clay jug on her shoulder, with the practiced ease of a woman who had done it thousands of times. Ezra sometimes accompanied her, helping to carry the second, smaller jug that the family kept for washing. It was on one such trip to the well that Ezra first saw her. Her name was Miriam, and she was the daughter of Caleb, a potter who had recently moved to the village from a settlement several days' journey to the south. She was perhaps a year younger than Ezra, with dark eyes that seemed to hold a quiet intelligence and a way of carrying herself that set her apart from the other girls. She did not chatter or giggle at the well. She moved with purpose, filled her jug efficiently, and left without lingering. But on this particular morning, their eyes met, just for a moment, across the crowded wellhead, and something shifted in the air between them. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of instant, overwhelming attraction that storytellers like to describe. It was subtler than that. It was recognition. As if, in the brief exchange of a glance, they had each seen something in the other that they had been searching for without knowing it. Ezra said nothing about it. In their world, a boy of 14 did not speak of such things openly. Marriage was a matter for parents to arrange, a transaction involving families, property, and social standing. Personal feelings, while not entirely irrelevant, were secondary to the practical considerations that governed such unions. But Ezra could not stop thinking about her. Over the following days, he found himself watching for her at the well, timing his walks through the village to coincide with the moments when she might be outside her father's workshop. He was not obvious about it. He was careful and discreet, but his mother noticed. Naomi always noticed. One evening, as they sat together grinding grain for the next day's bread, Naomi spoke without looking up. "Caleb's daughter seems like a sensible girl," she said casually. Ezra froze, the grinding stone still in his hands. "I have seen her at the well," Naomi continued. "She is hard-working, respectful. Her father is a skilled craftsman." She paused, then added, "Your father and I have been thinking about your future." Ezra's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to speak, wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but the words tangled in his throat. Naomi glanced at him, and for the first time, he saw not just his mother, but a woman who had once been young herself, who had once stood at a well and caught the eye of a farmer's son from the next valley. A small, knowing smile flickered across her face. "There is time," she said gently. But it is good to think about these things. The village council meeting that evening was about more than water rights. There was a growing tension in the community over a dispute between two families regarding the boundary of their grazing land. The argument had been simmering for weeks, and it had begun to divide the village into factions. Abram was called upon to give his opinion, as he was known for his fairness and his willingness to speak honestly, even when his words were unpopular. Ezra sat in the back of the gathering, watching the proceedings with a mixture of fascination and unease. The dispute was complicated. Both families had legitimate claims, both had witnesses who supported their version of events, and both were growing increasingly hostile toward each other. Abram stood and spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He did not take sides. Instead, he proposed a compromise. A shared grazing arrangement that would require both families to make concessions, but would preserve the peace of the community. Some people nodded, others frowned. Joram's father, the elder, watched with narrowed eyes, his expression unreadable. The compromise was eventually accepted, though grudgingly, and the meeting dissolved into small groups of murmured conversation. As they walked home under the stars, Abram was quiet. Ezra sensed that something was troubling his father. "Did you say the right thing?" Ezra asked, surprising himself with the directness of the question. Abram looked at him for a long moment. "I said what I believed was just," he replied. "Whether it was the right thing, only time will tell. That is the burden of trying to do good in a world where good is not always clear." They walked the rest of the way in silence, but something had changed between them. For the first time, Abram had spoken to Ezra not as a father to a child, but as one man to another. Right now, pause for a moment and type in the comments the words, "I believe in doing what is right, even when it is hard." Let the world see that there are still people who carry that conviction in their hearts. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. The weeks that followed were a time of slow, steady change. The season turned from planting to growing, and the fields began to show the first green shoots of barley pushing through the soil. Ezra worked alongside his father each day, but he also began to spend more time with Caleb, Miriam's father, who was teaching him the basics of pottery. It was not an official apprenticeship. Ezra was still his father's son, still committed to the family's farming, but Caleb was generous with his time and his knowledge, and Ezra found a deep satisfaction in shaping the wet clay on the simple wheel, in watching formless material take shape under his hands. Caleb was a different kind of man from Abram. Where Abram was quiet and steady, Caleb was animated and expressive. He told stories while he worked. Stories of the places he had traveled, the people he had met, the different customs and beliefs he had encountered in distant settlements. Ezra listened with wide eyes, his imagination ignited by descriptions of cities with walls as tall as trees, of marketplaces where you could find spices and textiles from lands so far away that no one even knew their names. For a boy who had never traveled more than a day's walk from his village, these stories were intoxicating. But it was not just the stories that drew Ezra to Caleb's workshop. It was Miriam. She often helped her father, carrying water to mix the clay, organizing the finished pots for drying, and sweeping the workshop floor. She and Ezra rarely spoke directly. That would have been improper. But they developed a language of glances, of small gestures, of the careful way they moved around each other in the confined space. When their hands accidentally brushed while reaching for the same tool, they both pulled back as if the clay between them had suddenly turned to fire. But neither of them stopped coming back. Naomi watched all of this from a distance, and she spoke to Abram about it one evening after the children were asleep. "Caleb is a good man," she said. "His daughter would bring strength to our family." Abram considered this carefully. "Caleb is new to the village," he replied. "Some people are still unsure of him, of his background, of where he comes from." Naomi set down her spindle and looked at her husband directly. "We were all new once," she said. "Your own grandfather came from a village 3 valleys away. People talked about him too at first, but he proved himself through his work and his faithfulness. Give Caleb the same chance." Abram was silent for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. "I will speak to him," he said, "but not yet. Let the harvest come first. Let us see what kind of season the land gives us." The harvest season approached with the grinding inevitability of the turning earth. The barley was beginning to ripen, the stalks heavy with grain, bending slightly in the afternoon breeze. It was a sight that never failed to move Abram, the visible evidence of months of labor, of prayer, of trust. But this year, there was an undercurrent of anxiety in the village. The rains had been lighter than usual, and some of the fields on the higher ground were showing signs of stress. If the final rains did not come soon, the harvest would be lean. And a lean harvest in their world did not simply mean lower profits or reduced savings. It meant hunger. It meant difficult choices about which animals to keep and which to trade. It meant counting every handful of grain and rationing every drop of oil through the long, cold months ahead. Abram prayed more fervently than usual. He rose earlier, stayed at his devotions longer, and spoke to Ezra about the importance of trust in times of uncertainty. "This is when faith matters most," he told his son. "Not when the storehouses are full and the rain falls on schedule. Anyone can believe when things are easy. The true test comes when the ground is dry and the sky is empty." Ezra heard the words, but they landed differently now than they would have even a few months earlier. He was beginning to understand, not just intellectually but in his bones, what his father meant. The vulnerability of their existence, the razor-thin margin between sufficiency and want, made the act of trust feel less like a passive acceptance and more like an act of profound courage. To plant a seed in uncertain ground and believe it would grow, that was not weakness, that was defiance of despair. The rains came, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of the gentle, steady showers that the crops needed, a massive storm system moved in from the west, bringing 2 days of torrential downpour that turned the dry riverbeds into raging torrents and sent cascading sheets of water down the hillside terraces. The damage was swift and devastating. Several of the lower fields were flooded, the young grain beaten flat and half buried in mud. One of the terrace walls on Abram's land collapsed, sending a river of stones and soil down into the olive grove below. 2 of the village's sheep pens were washed out, and several animals were lost in the chaos. The morning after the storm, Ezra stood at the edge of their upper field and looked out over the destruction. The landscape had been transformed. What had been orderly rows of ripening grain was now a churned mess of mud and debris. The olive trees, ancient and gnarled, stood like wounded soldiers, their lower branches stripped and tangled with brush. Abram stood beside his son, his face a mask of controlled emotion. He did not cry. He did not rage against the sky. He simply looked at the damage, took a deep breath, and said, "We rebuild." The days that followed were among the hardest Ezra had ever known. The family worked from before dawn until after dark, clearing debris, repairing the terrace wall stone by stone, salvaging what grain could be saved. Naomi worked alongside them, her arms caked with mud to the elbows, her voice steady as she directed the boys in sorting the damaged crops from the salvageable ones. Even little Micah, who was usually prone to complaining, worked without a single word of protest. He seemed to understand, in the way that children sometimes grasp things that are too big for words, that this was a moment that required everything from all of them. The village too came together. Neighbors who had been divided by the grazing dispute set aside their differences to help each other repair the damage. Caleb, the potter, closed his workshop for 3 days and spent his time helping Abram rebuild the collapsed terrace. He worked alongside them without being asked, without expecting anything in return. It was this act of generosity that finally shifted Abram's opinion of the man. As they labored together in the mud, lifting stones that were almost too heavy for one man, Abram saw in Caleb the qualities that mattered most: reliability, selflessness, and the quiet strength that comes from doing what is needed without seeking recognition. One evening, as they rested together after a long day of repair work, Abram turned to Caleb and said simply, "You are a good man." Caleb looked surprised, then smiled. "I am just a man who remembers what it is like to need help and to have no one offer it," he replied. "When I moved here with my daughter, I was alone. I had lost my wife 2 years before. Miriam was all I had left. Your village took us in when others might have turned us away. I do not forget that." Abram nodded slowly, and something passed between the two men, an unspoken agreement, an understanding that went beyond words. It was the beginning of a bond that would shape both their families for years to come. Miriam, too, had been working tirelessly. She brought water and food to the workers in the fields, helped Naomi with the household tasks that had doubled in the aftermath of the storm, and tended to a neighbor's child who had fallen ill from the damp and cold. Ezra watched her move through the chaos with a calm purposefulness that made her seem older than her years. She did not complain. She did not seek attention or praise. She simply did what needed to be done, with a quiet dignity that spoke volumes about the kind of person she was becoming. One afternoon, as Ezra was carrying a load of stones from the collapsed wall, he stumbled and fell, the stones scattering across the muddy ground. His ankle twisted beneath him, and a sharp pain shot up his leg. He lay in the mud for a moment, frustrated and embarrassed, trying to push himself up. Then a hand appeared in front of his face. He looked up. Miriam was standing over him, her hand extended, her dark eyes calm and direct. "Take my hand," she said simply. It was the first full sentence she had ever spoken to him. Ezra took her hand. Her grip was firm and warm. She pulled him to his feet, and for a moment they stood face to face, closer than they had ever been. The world around them, the mud, the ruins, the distant voices of the work crews, seemed to recede. There was only the two of them, standing in the wreckage of a storm, holding on to each other as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Then Miriam released his hand, nodded once, and turned back to her work. Ezra stood there for a long moment, his ankle throbbing, his heart racing, watching her walk away. He did not know it yet, could not possibly have known it. But that single moment, that simple act of reaching out, would become the foundation upon which everything that followed would be built. The recovery from the storm took weeks. Not everything could be saved. A significant portion of the barley crop was lost, and the olive yield would be reduced. But the family adapted, as families in their world always did. Abram traded some of their stored grain for additional oil from a neighbor whose olives had been spared. Naomi stretched their food supplies with creative cooking, thinner stews, bread mixed with ground wild seeds, and foraged greens from the hillsides. They would not go hungry, but the margin was tighter than it had ever been. Through it all, the rhythm of prayer continued. Morning and evening, the family gathered. The ancient words were spoken. The devotions were observed. But Ezra noticed something different in his father's prayers after the storm. There was a rawness to them, an urgency that had not been there before. Abram's voice sometimes trembled. His pauses were longer, heavier with meaning. It was as if the storm had stripped away some layer of routine, some comfortable familiarity, and exposed the beating heart of what faith really was. Not a shield against suffering, but a way of enduring it. a way of standing in the wreckage and choosing to believe that the ruins could become foundations. One night, unable to sleep, Ezra found his father sitting alone in the courtyard, the oil lamp casting a small circle of light around his hunched figure. Abram was not praying. He was simply sitting, staring at his hands. Ezra sat down beside him. They said nothing for a long time. Then Abram spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. When I was your age, I thought faith meant that bad things would not happen. That if we did everything right, prayed the right words, made the right offerings, kept the right laws, we would be protected. He paused, flexing his bruised and calloused fingers. I was wrong. Faith is not protection. Faith is the decision to keep going when the protection fails, to plant again when the storm has destroyed everything, to love again when loss has broken your heart. He turned to look at his son, and Ezra saw for the first time the tears that his father had been holding back. That is what I want you to understand, Ezra. Not just the words, the meaning behind the words. Ezra reached out and placed his hand on his father's arm. No words were needed. In that moment, in the quiet darkness of a small courtyard in an ancient village, something was passed from one generation to the next. Not a formula, not a doctrine, but something far more precious. A willingness to be vulnerable, a courage to keep believing in the face of evidence that belief might be foolish, an understanding that faith, at its deepest, is not about certainty. It is about choosing hope when every rational argument points toward despair. +3+. The harvest, when it finally came, was not the disaster everyone had feared, but it was not the abundance they had hoped for either. It was somewhere in between, enough to survive the coming winter, but not enough to feel secure. The village marked the end of the harvest with a communal feast, as they did every year. It was one of the most important events in their calendar, a time when the entire community gathered to give thanks, to share food, and to strengthen the bonds that held them together through the difficult seasons ahead. The feast was held in the open area near the village threshing floor, a large flat circle of packed earth where the grain had been separated from the straw. Tables were improvised from planks laid across stone supports. Every family contributed what they could: bread, roasted grain, dried fruits, olives, cheese, and the rare, precious luxury of honey. A few families brought wine, dark, thick, and sweet, pressed from the grapes grown on the slopes above the village. Children ran between the tables, shrieking with laughter. Women gathered in clusters, sharing news and advice. Men stood in groups, discussing the season past and making plans for the one ahead. Ezra helped his mother carry their family's contribution: 3 large loaves of bread and a pot of lentil stew that Naomi had seasoned with cumin and coriander. As they approached the gathering, Ezra scanned the crowd for Miriam. He found her near her father's table, helping to arrange a display of Caleb's finest pottery, beautifully crafted bowls and cups that he had made specifically for the feast as gifts for the community. It was a gesture of generosity that did not go unnoticed. Several villagers stopped to admire the work and to thank Caleb, who accepted the praise with modest grace. Abram found Caleb and clasped his arm in the traditional greeting of friendship. The two men had grown close in the weeks since the storm, and their families had begun to spend time together, sharing meals, helping each other with tasks, developing the kind of deep, practical friendship that was the foundation of community life in their world. Naomi and Miriam, too, had formed a bond. Naomi saw in the young girl a reflection of her own younger self, capable, resilient, and possessed of a quiet wisdom that belied her years. She had begun teaching Miriam some of her own skills: the art of bread making, the use of medicinal herbs, the complex weaving patterns that were Naomi's specialty. The feast began with a communal blessing, spoken by the village elder, Joram's father, a man named Ehud. He was a large man with a commanding voice and a shrewd mind for politics. He gave thanks for the harvest, acknowledged the hardships of the season, and called upon the community to support one another through the winter ahead. His words were practiced and polished, the speech of a man accustomed to public performance. Ezra listened respectfully, but he noticed that his father's face was tense. Something was wrong. The trouble began during the meal. Joram, emboldened by wine and the attention of a group of young men his age, began making comments about Caleb. Not directly, not openly, but in the sideways, insinuating manner that was his specialty. He mentioned newcomers who should be grateful for the community's generosity. He made jokes about people who trade dirt for pots and think they can buy friendship with clay cups. The young men around him laughed, but it was an uneasy laughter. Everyone knew who he was talking about. Caleb, seated nearby, heard every word. His face remained calm, but Ezra could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. Miriam, sitting beside her father, placed her hand on his arm, the same steadying gesture that Abram had once used on Ezra. Caleb covered her hand with his own and shook his head slightly. Not here. Not now. But Ezra was not so restrained. The anger that flooded through him was sudden and fierce, a hot, bright surge that made his hand shake and his vision narrow. He started to rise from his seat, but Abram's hand closed around his wrist like an iron band. "No," his father said, his voice barely audible. "This is not the way." Ezra turned to his father, his eyes blazing. "He is insulting them," he hissed, "in front of everyone." Abram's grip did not loosen. "And if you respond with anger, you give his words power they do not deserve. Sit down. Trust me." Ezra sat down. It was one of the hardest things he had ever done. Every fiber of his being wanted to stand up, to walk across the gathering, to tell Joram exactly what he thought of him, but he trusted his father. He did not understand why Abram wanted him to stay silent, but he trusted the man who had taught him everything he knew. And so he sat, his hands clenched in his lap, his jaw aching from being clenched so tightly. What happened next, he did not expect. Abram stood. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood, picked up one of the beautiful cups that Caleb had made, and walked to the center of the gathering where everyone could see him. The conversation around the tables gradually fell silent. All eyes turned to the quiet farmer standing in the firelight, holding a potter's cup in his rough hands. "This cup," Abram said, holding it up for all to see, "was made by the hands of my friend Caleb, a man who came to our village with nothing but his skill and his daughter, a man who, when the storm destroyed our fields, closed his own workshop and spent 3 days helping us rebuild our walls." He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. "I have been farming this land for 20 years. I have worked beside many of you. I have seen the best and the worst of our community. And I can tell you this, the measure of a man is not where he comes from. It is not the size of his flock or the number of his fields. The measure of a man is what he does when his neighbors are in trouble." He turned slowly, letting his gaze pass over every face in the gathering. When his eyes reached Joram, they paused, not with anger but with a quiet, devastating clarity. "I drink from this cup tonight," Abram said, "in honor of a good man and his family. And I thank the Almighty that they found their way to our village." He raised the cup, drank, and sat down. The silence that followed was profound. Then, one by one, people began to nod. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several villagers rose to shake Caleb's hand, to clap him on the back, to offer words of welcome and appreciation that should have been spoken months ago. Caleb's eyes glistened, but he held himself with dignity, accepting each gesture with quiet gratitude. Miriam, beside him, was smiling, a small, radiant smile that Ezra would remember for the rest of his life. Joram sat in his corner, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and resentment. His father, Ehud, watched the scene with an inscrutable expression. Later, after the feast had ended and the families were walking home under the stars, Ehud stopped Abram on the path. "That was well done," the elder said. His tone was careful, measured. "But Joram will not forget." Abram met his gaze. "Nor will I ask him to. I ask only that he learn from it." Ehud regarded him for a long moment, then nodded slowly and walked away into the darkness. That night, as the family settled into their sleeping room, Ezra lay awake, replaying the evening in his mind. He thought about his father's words, about the cup held up in the firelight, about the silence that had fallen like a blessing over the gathering. He thought about Joram's humiliation and whether it would lead to growth or to bitterness. He thought about Miriam's smile, and he realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that he had just witnessed something far more powerful than any lesson taught from a scroll or recited from memory. He had witnessed faith made visible, not in prayers or rituals, but in the simple, courageous act of standing up for what was right. The winter came, as winters always did, with a slow, creeping cold that settled into the bones and refused to leave. The family spent most of their time indoors, gathered around the small hearth in the center of the house, conserving warmth and rationing their food supplies with careful precision. It was during these long, dark months that the family's bond was tested most severely. The close quarters, the limited food, the monotony of short days and endless nights, these things wore on everyone's patience. Micah grew restless and irritable. Naomi developed a persistent cough that kept her awake at night. Even Abram, usually so steady, became quieter than usual, retreating into long silences that worried Ezra more than any angry words would have. But the routines held: morning prayers, evening recitations, shared meals, however meager. The rituals that might have seemed empty or repetitive in times of plenty revealed their true purpose in times of scarcity. They were not just traditions. They were anchors. They gave shape to days that might otherwise have dissolved into formless despair. They reminded the family who they were, where they came from, and what they believed, even when belief felt more like a stubborn refusal to give up than a joyful embrace of the divine. Ezra took on more responsibilities during the winter. He rose before his father each morning to tend the animals, their remaining goats and the single ox, who were sheltered in a rough lean-to attached to the side of the house. He repaired tools, mended clothing, and began teaching Micah the skills that Abram had taught him. Not just practical skills, but the stories and songs and sacred words that were the family's most precious inheritance. It gave him a strange, fierce pride to see Micah's face light up with understanding when a difficult passage finally clicked into place. He was beginning to understand from the inside out why Abram had spent so many hours teaching him. It was not because the words themselves had magical power. It was because the act of passing them on, of sitting together in the firelight and speaking the ancient syllables aloud, was itself an act of faith, a declaration that the future existed, that there would be someone to remember. During the winter, Abram formally approached Caleb about the possibility of a betrothal between Ezra and Miriam. The conversation took place over several evenings, conducted with the careful, respectful formality that such matters required. There was no rush. There was no pressure. Both fathers understood the weight of what they were discussing. Not just the joining of two young people, but the merging of two families, two histories, two sets of traditions and hopes and fears. Caleb was cautious. He asked about Abram's land holdings, about his plans for the future, about how Ezra would provide for a wife and eventual children. Abram answered honestly, without embellishment. He did not pretend to be wealthier than he was, or to have resources he lacked. He offered what he had, a modest but stable household, a hard-working son with a good heart, and a family that valued faithfulness above all else. Caleb listened to everything, asked his questions, and then said he would think about it. Abram nodded, unsurprised. These things took time. They were not decided in a single conversation or even in a single season. They were woven slowly, like the fabric on Naomi's loom, thread by thread, row by row, until the pattern emerged. What neither father knew was that Miriam and Ezra had been conducting their own quiet negotiation. Not about marriage directly, they were both too young and too respectful of their parents' authority for that, but about the future they each imagined. They spoke in stolen moments, brief exchanges at the well, a few words passed during a community gathering, and once, a longer conversation when they found themselves alone at Caleb's workshop while he was out delivering pottery to a neighboring village. Miriam told Ezra about her mother, who had died when Miriam was 10, a woman of extraordinary warmth and skill who had taught her daughter everything she knew before a fever took her in a single terrible week. She spoke of her fear that she would forget her mother's face, that the memories would fade until there was nothing left but a vague, aching sense of loss. Ezra listened with his whole being. He did not try to offer comfort or advice. He simply listened, and in his listening, Miriam found something she had not known she was missing: the sense of being truly heard. In return, Ezra told her about his doubts. Not the small, manageable doubts that everyone experienced from time to time, but the deeper, more fundamental questions that had been growing inside him for months. What if the prayers were just words? What if the traditions were just habits? What if there was nothing beyond the hills, nothing beyond the stars, nothing beyond the thin, fragile shell of their daily existence? He had never spoken these thoughts aloud to anyone. The words felt dangerous and thrilling as they left his mouth, like releasing birds from a cage. Miriam listened, her dark eyes serious and thoughtful. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I do not know the answers to your questions. I do not think anyone does. But I know this: the people who raised you, who taught you those words, who built this life for you, they are real. Their love is real. And maybe that is where it all begins. Not with certainty, but with love." Ezra carried those words with him through the rest of the winter like a lamp in the darkness. Spring came slowly, tentatively, as if the earth itself was unsure whether it was ready to trust the warmth again. The first green shoots appeared in the fields. The almond trees blossomed, white and delicate against the brown hillsides. The village stirred back to life, like a creature emerging from hibernation, stretching and blinking in the strengthening sun. Planting began again, the ancient cycle repeating itself with the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that had marked every season since the beginning of time. Caleb gave his answer. It was yes. The betrothal would proceed, to be formalized at the next community gathering, with the understanding that the actual marriage would take place when both Ezra and Miriam were a year older. It was a practical arrangement. More time meant more preparation, more resources accumulated, a stronger foundation for the new household they would eventually establish. But for Ezra, the practical details were secondary. What mattered was the promise. The commitment that whatever the future held, storms or sunshine, abundance or scarcity, he would not face it alone. The betrothal ceremony was simple, as everything in their lives was simple. It took place at the village gathering, in the presence of both families and the community. Abram and Caleb stood together, their hands clasped, and spoke the formal words that bound their children's futures. Ezra and Miriam stood before them, not touching, not speaking, but so intensely aware of each other that the air between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken meaning. The village elder pronounced the blessing. The community gave their approval with murmurs and nods and a few scattered cheers from the younger members. And just like that, the future that Ezra had been imagining, uncertain and frightening and wonderful, became real. That evening, after the celebration, Abram took Ezra aside. They walked together to the edge of the upper field, the same field where they had worked side by side for so many seasons. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bands of gold and deep crimson. The newly planted barley was just beginning to show above the soil, tiny, fragile threads of green emerging from the dark earth. Abram stood for a long time, looking out over the land, his face bathed in the warm light. "I have not always known the right things to say to you," Abram said at last. His voice was rough, weighted with emotion. "I have not always had answers to your questions. There have been nights when I lay awake, wondering if I was teaching you well enough, guiding you truly enough, giving you what you would need to navigate a world that I cannot protect you from." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I want you to know this. Everything I have done, every prayer I have spoken, every stone I have lifted, every lesson I have tried to teach you, all of it was driven by one thing. Not duty, not tradition, not fear. Love, the kind of love that does not need to understand everything in order to act. The kind that does not wait for certainty before it commits. The kind that simply says, 'I am here, and I will not leave.'" Ezra stood beside his father, the tears running freely down his cheeks, making no effort to hide them. "I know," he said. "I have always known." And in that moment, standing in the fading light at the edge of a field that had been planted and harvested and destroyed and replanted more times than anyone could count, Ezra understood what faith truly was. It was not a set of beliefs. It was not a collection of rituals. It was not certainty or security or a guarantee against pain. It was his father's weathered hands on the plow. It was his mother's voice humming over the bread dough. It was Miriam's hand reaching down to pull him out of the mud. It was Caleb closing his workshop to help a neighbor rebuild. It was the simple, stubbornly beautiful act of planting seeds in uncertain ground and choosing to believe that they would grow. The stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. Father and son stood together, watching the light fade and the familiar constellations emerge. The same stars that their ancestors had watched, the same stars that their descendants would watch long after the last trace of their small, hard, beautiful lives had vanished from the earth. They did not speak. They did not need to. The silence between them was full of everything that mattered, everything that endured, everything that made the difficult work of living worthwhile. Behind them in the village, the evening fires were being lit. The smell of bread baking drifted up the hillside. Somewhere a child was laughing. Somewhere a mother was singing. Somewhere an old man was repeating the ancient words, the same words that Abram had spoken that very morning, the same words that Ezra would speak tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and every morning for the rest of his life. Not because he was certain they were true, but because he had decided that they were worth believing. And that decision, made fresh each day in the face of doubt and hardship and the relentless passage of time, was the truest act of devotion he would ever know. Naomi appeared in the doorway of their house, a silhouette against the warm glow of the hearth. "Come inside," she called. "The meal is ready." Abram placed his hand on Ezra's shoulder one last time, a brief, firm pressure that carried the weight of everything they had shared. And they turned together and walked home. The door closed behind them. The night settled over the village, and the ancient rhythm continued, as it always had, as it always would. Prayer and bread, work and rest, love and faith, woven together into the fabric of a life that, for all its simplicity, for all its hardship, was rich beyond measure. The months that followed the betrothal were marked by a new kind of energy in Abram's household. There was purpose in every task now, a forward momentum that had not been there before. Ezra worked the fields with a dedication that surprised even his father. He was building something, not just a harvest, but a future. Every stone he stacked, every row he plowed, every handful of seed he planted was an investment in the life he and Miriam would share. It transformed the grueling labor from something endured into something embraced. Naomi, too, was energized. She began setting aside portions of their supplies, a little extra grain here, a measure of oil there, slowly building a reserve that would form the foundation of Ezra and Miriam's household. She taught Miriam with increased intensity, sharing not just practical skills, but the deeper knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women. The healing herbs, the birthing wisdom, the quiet diplomacy of managing relationships within a close-knit community. These were lessons that no one wrote down, that existed only in the living memory of the women who practiced them. Each one was precious. Each one represented a link in a chain that stretched back further than anyone could trace. Micah, now 9, was growing quickly. He had lost the roundness of childhood and was becoming lean and wiry, his hands already showing the calluses of daily labor. He adored Miriam with the open, uncomplicated affection of a younger brother, and she returned his devotion with warmth and patience. She taught him to make small clay figures on her father's wheel, animals mostly, rough little shapes that Micah treasured as if they were made of gold. Caleb watched these interactions with quiet pleasure. His daughter, who had carried so much grief and responsibility since her mother's passing, was blossoming in the warmth of this new family. The heaviness that had shadowed her eyes was lifting, replaced by something brighter, not the absence of pain, but the presence of hope alongside it. But the world beyond the village did not stand still. Travelers brought news of unrest in the distant regions, conflicts between powerful clans over territory and trade routes, shifting alliances that sent ripples of instability across the land. These were distant concerns for a small farming community, but they were not irrelevant. The trade routes affected the availability of goods that the village could not produce itself. Metals, salt, certain types of cloth, and the exotic spices that were used for both cooking and medicinal purposes. When the routes were disrupted, prices rose, and small communities like theirs felt the squeeze. More immediately troubling was the news that a new tax had been imposed by the regional authority, a levy on grain harvests that would require every household to surrender a portion of their crop. For families like Abram's, already operating on thin margins, this was a serious blow. The village council met several times to discuss the situation, and the debates were heated. Some argued for compliance, reasoning that resistance would only bring harsher consequences. Others, led by Ehud, advocated for negotiation, sending a delegation to the regional center to appeal for a reduced rate. A few hotheads, including Joram, suggested simply refusing to pay, though this position was quickly dismissed by the older, wiser heads. Abram, as usual, spoke little during the debates, but thought deeply. He discussed the matter with Caleb during their evening visits, the two men sitting in Abram's courtyard, speaking in low voices while the firelight cast long shadows on the clay walls. Caleb, who had traveled more widely than most of the villagers, had a broader perspective on the political realities they faced. "Resistance is foolish," he told Abram. "I have seen what happens to communities that defy the authorities. The consequences are swift and devastating, but compliance without negotiation is also dangerous. It sets a precedent. This year it is a portion of the grain. Next year it will be more. We must find a middle path." Abram agreed. He volunteered to be part of the delegation that would travel to the regional center, a journey of 2 days each way. It would be the first time he had left the village in nearly 15 years, and the prospect filled him with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Naomi was worried. She said little, but Ezra could see it in the way she moved. A tightness in her shoulders, a heaviness in her step. The world beyond the village was dangerous and unpredictable, and the thought of her husband walking into it, unprotected by the familiar boundaries of their community, was deeply unsettling. The morning of Abram's departure was cool and gray. He dressed in his best garment, a tunic of undyed wool, clean and carefully mended, and packed a small bag with bread, cheese, and a goatskin of water. The delegation consisted of 4 men: Abram, Ehud, a merchant named Reuben, and a younger man named Asher, who spoke several languages and would serve as their translator. They gathered at the village gate as the first light broke through the clouds, and the small crowd that had come to see them off murmured prayers and words of encouragement. Ezra stood beside his mother, watching his father prepare to leave. It was a strange feeling, the reversal of the usual order, the father going out while the son stayed behind. Abram knelt before Micah and embraced him tightly. Then he stood before Naomi and placed his hands on her shoulders. No words were spoken between them. None were needed. Their eyes said everything. The worry, the love, the unshakable trust that they would see each other again. Then Abram turned to Ezra. He looked at his son, truly looked at him, and Ezra saw in his father's eyes something he had never seen before. Pride. Not the boastful, performative pride that some fathers displayed, but something quieter and deeper. The pride of a man who sees in his child the continuation of everything he has lived for. "Take care of our family," Abram said. It was not a request. It was an acknowledgement. Ezra nodded. "I will." Abram clasped his son's arm, the grip of equals, and then turned and walked through the gate with the other men, down the path that led away from the village and into the wide, uncertain world beyond. The days of Abram's absence were a test. Ezra rose before dawn each morning, performed the household devotions that his father normally led, and organized the day's work for himself and Micah. He managed the animals, tended the fields, and dealt with the small but constant stream of decisions that the head of a household must make. When to irrigate, how to divide the remaining feed, whether to trade 2 measures of barley for a jar of olive oil from a neighbor. He discovered, to his surprise, that he was capable. Not perfect. He made mistakes, misjudged the timing of a planting, was too generous in a trade that left them slightly short. But capable. The foundation his father had built was strong enough to hold. Miriam visited every day, always with a practical excuse. Bringing bread from her father's oven, returning a bowl that Naomi had lent, delivering a message from a neighbor. But they both knew the real reason. She came to be near him, and he was grateful for her presence in ways he could not articulate. They did not speak of their feelings openly. The customs of their world did not permit it, and neither of them felt the need to name what was growing between them. It was there, as real as the sun and the soil, and naming it would not make it any more real. If anything, the unspoken nature of their connection made it stronger. A private understanding that belonged to them alone, untouched by the opinions or expectations of others. Naomi, despite her worry, was a pillar of strength. She maintained the household routines with unwavering consistency, ensuring that the family's life continued its familiar rhythms even in Abram's absence. She cooked, cleaned, wove, and prayed, her hands never still, her voice steady. But at night, when she thought no one was listening, Ezra heard her whisper his father's name in the darkness. A soft, repeated prayer that was equal parts devotion and longing. Abram returned after 6 days, 2 days longer than expected, which had caused a growing panic in the village. He came back tired, dusty, and thinner, but with news that was cautiously positive. The delegation had been received by the regional official, and after extensive negotiations, they had secured a reduced tax rate, still a burden, but manageable. The official had been impressed by their respectful but firm approach, and had even hinted that communities who cooperated peacefully might receive favorable treatment in future dealings. It was not a victory exactly, but it was not a defeat either. It was survival, which in their world was the closest thing to triumph that ordinary people could expect. The reunion was quiet and private. Abram walked through the gate, and Naomi was waiting. She did not run to him. She did not cry out. She simply stood, her hands clasped in front of her, and watched him approach. When he reached her, he took her hands in his and pressed them to his forehead. It was a gesture of gratitude, of relief, of the profound, unspeakable love that bound them together. Ezra and Micah hung back, giving their parents this moment, and then rushed forward to embrace their father with the unrestrained joy that only children can express. That evening, the family gathered around the hearth, and Abram told them about his journey. He described the road, the landscape, the settlements they had passed through, each one larger and more complex than their own village. He told them about the regional center, with its stone buildings and busy markets, its officials in fine robes and its soldiers carrying polished weapons. He described the negotiation itself, the careful back and forth, the moments of tension, the final handshake that sealed the agreement. And he told them something else, something that clearly moved him deeply. In the regional center, he had visited a great gathering place of worship, a structure far larger and more ornate than anything in their village. Hundreds of people had been gathered there, speaking the same ancient words that Abram spoke each morning in his small courtyard. The same prayers, the same songs, the same devotions that his family had kept for generations. "I stood among them," Abram said, his voice thick with emotion. "And for the first time I understood how large this thing is that we are part of. We are not alone in our prayers. We are not a single voice calling into an empty sky. We are one voice among thousands, among tens of thousands, all speaking the same words, all reaching toward the same hope." And knowing that, truly knowing it, changed something in me. He paused, looking at each of his family members in turn. We are small. Our lives are short. Our troubles are many. But we are connected to something vast and enduring, something that stretches across the hills and the valleys and the rivers, something that has been alive since before our grandparents' grandparents drew their first breath. And as long as we keep speaking the words, keep living the faith, keep passing it on to those who come after us, it will never end. The fire crackled. The shadows danced on the walls, and the family sat together in the warmth, held by the ancient rhythm that had sustained them through every storm, every drought, every moment of doubt and fear and wondering. And for Ezra, who had spent so many months wrestling with questions that had no easy answers, something finally settled into place. Not the answers themselves. He suspected those would never come, not fully, not in this life. But something better. The peace of accepting the questions, the freedom of living with uncertainty, the deep, abiding joy of being part of a story so much larger than himself. A story that had been unfolding since the dawn of time and would continue unfolding long after the dust of his bones had been scattered by the wind. A year passed. The seasons turned in their eternal cycle, planting, growing, harvesting, resting, and each one brought its own blessings and its own trials. The tax burden was manageable, as Abram had hoped, and the harvest that year was better than expected. The rains came at the right times, the soil was generous, and the storehouses were fuller than they had been in several years. The village breathed a collective sigh of relief, and the communal feast that marked the end of the harvest season was the largest and most joyful in memory. Joram had changed. The humiliation of the previous year's feast had not, as Ehud had feared, turned him bitter. Instead, something unexpected had happened. He had sought out Caleb, tentatively at first, then with increasing openness, and asked to learn pottery. It was a shocking development, given his family's status and the prevailing attitude that manual crafts were beneath the elder's son. But Caleb, who was not a man to hold grudges, had welcomed him with the same generosity he showed everyone. The lessons were difficult for Joram, who had never worked with his hands in any sustained way, but he persisted. And in the quiet concentration required to shape clay on the wheel, something in his character began to shift. The arrogance softened. The sharp tongue grew quieter. He would never be a gentle man. His nature was too forceful for that. But he was becoming something better than he had been. He was becoming honest. Ezra watched this transformation with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. He and Joram would never be friends exactly. The differences in their temperaments and backgrounds were too great for easy intimacy. But they developed a respectful understanding, a willingness to acknowledge each other's strengths and to work together when the community needed them. It was not forgiveness in the dramatic, cathartic sense that storytellers favored. It was something more real and more valuable, the slow, unglamorous work of building trust where there had been none. The day of Ezra and Miriam's marriage arrived with the first warm winds of spring. The ceremony was simple and beautiful, conducted at the village gathering place, with both families and the entire community in attendance. Miriam wore a garment that Naomi had woven specifically for the occasion, a soft, cream-colored cloth edged with a pattern of intertwining vines that had taken months to complete. Ezra wore his father's best tunic, slightly too large in the shoulders, which only made him look younger and more earnest. They stood before the village elder and their families, and the ancient words of binding were spoken, words that joined not just two individuals, but two histories, two lineages, two streams of memory and hope flowing together into a single river. Caleb gave his daughter away with tears streaming openly down his face, making no effort to hide them. He was not losing her, he knew. He was gaining a son, a new family, a deeper rootedness in the community that had taken him in. But the moment was heavy with the memory of his wife, who should have been standing beside him, who should have been adjusting Miriam's garment and whispering last-minute advice and weeping her own tears of joy. Her absence was a presence, felt by everyone who knew the story. And in that absence, there was a kind of sacredness, a reminder that love endures beyond the reach of even the most final of partings. Abram stood beside Caleb, his hand on his friend's shoulder, steady and strong. Naomi wept silently, her hand pressed to her mouth, overcome by the bittersweet intensity of the moment. Little Micah, now 10, stood tall and tried very hard to look serious and dignified, though his face kept breaking into an irrepressible grin. After the ceremony, there was feasting and music and laughter that lasted well into the night. Children ran in circles, drunk on excitement and honey cakes. Old women clapped their hands and sang songs that had been sung at weddings since before anyone could remember. Old men sat together and told stories, each one trying to outdo the others with tales of their own youth. And at the center of it all, Ezra and Miriam sat side by side, finally able to be together in the open, in the light, without the constraints and cautions that had governed their relationship for so long. They spoke little. They did not need to. The future, vast, unknown, terrifying, and beautiful, stretched out before them like an unplowed field, waiting for the first furrow. That night, after the celebrations had ended and the village had settled into sleep, Ezra stood alone in the doorway of the small house that he and Miriam would now share, a modest structure that he had helped build with his own hands during the previous months, using stones from the same fields his family had farmed for generations. The moonlight poured over the valley, turning the familiar landscape into something silver and strange, as if the world had been remade in the night while no one was watching. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of almond blossoms and fresh earth. He thought about his father's words, about being a caretaker, about the land that existed before and would exist after, about the vast, invisible network of voices all speaking the same ancient words. He thought about his mother's hands on the bread dough, her quiet songs at the loom, her whispered prayers in the darkness. He thought about Caleb's generosity, about Miriam's steady gaze, about Micah's laughter, about the collapsed terrace wall rebuilt stone by stone, about the cup held up in the firelight. He thought about all the questions he had asked and all the answers he had not received, and he realized that the questions themselves had been the answer all along. They had kept him searching. They had kept him honest. They had prevented him from settling for a faith that was too small, too comfortable, too easy to carry. The faith he had found, or that had found him, was something wilder and more demanding. It asked him to live with uncertainty. It asked him to choose trust over knowledge, hope over proof, love over fear. It asked him every single day to plant seeds in uncertain ground and believe that they would grow. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool night air, and whispered the first words of the morning blessing, even though it was not yet morning. The words felt different now. They were the same words he had spoken every day of his life, the same ancient syllables, the same carefully preserved phrases. But they carried a new weight, a new depth, because he was speaking them not out of habit or obligation, but out of choice. Out of the hard-won understanding that faith is not something you have. It is something you do. Every day. Every moment. In every decision to be kind when cruelty would be easier. To be generous when scarcity makes you want to hoard. To be honest when deception would protect you. To keep planting when the storms keep coming. Behind him, Miriam stirred. She appeared in the doorway, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cool air. She stood beside him looking out at the moonlit valley. She did not ask what he was doing or why he was standing there in the middle of the night, speaking prayers to an empty sky. She simply slipped her hand into his and stood with him. Together, looking forward, ready. The night deepened. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient, unhurried procession, and somewhere, in the distance, a bird began to sing. The first tentative notes of a new day, still hours from dawn, but coming, always coming. This is what religious family life was like in biblical times. Not the grand dramas that the epic narratives recorded, not the miraculous events that became legend, but the daily, unglamorous, profoundly human work of living faithfully in an uncertain world. The bread baked before dawn, the prayers spoken in the darkness, the hands extended to help a fallen neighbor, the seeds planted in rocky soil, the stories told around the fire. The love passed down, generation after generation, like a flame cupped in careful hands, shielded from the wind, carried forward into the unknown. This was their faith. This was their life. And in its simplicity, in its stubborn, beautiful ordinariness, it was extraordinary. If you watched all the way to the end, it's because you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and find out who truly loves the stories on this channel. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because every week stories like this one are created to take you into worlds that history books forgot, and every subscription helps us keep bringing these journeys to you. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share it with someone who also needs to hear that faith is not about certainty. It's about the courage to keep planting, even when the storm has already taken everything. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.